So, as we discussed in my last episode, we now know that my son is ADHD. What is it like when you are ADHD, when you're PDA and you've got a kid who's ADHD, PDA, autistic, when you've got that kind of relationship of understanding, but it also holds a mirror up in many ways? Well, our guest today, Sarah, is in exactly that position. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi.
Sarah and I met. We are both part of a group called Parental Mind, which is a charity in Devon here that work on supporting parents and carers of SEND kids. And we've gone on from that to we've done some peer support training and stuff like that. And we kind of met up, and Sarah just really impressed me because she's somebody who's very open about being neurodivergent herself. And it's something that's come from, you've often heard this, we've talked about it many times, that so many parents I know who have neurodivergent kids suddenly click that this might be me as well. So, I mean, Sarah, did you want to give us a bit of a feel of what your life is like, what your family's like?
I think what's been really interesting in my journey is that initially it was my partner that had ADHD. And so we were looking out for ADHD in my son pretty early doors, and he was premature. So with prematurity, there's already a higher risk of behavioural and neurological conditions. And so from about the age of 3, I was pretty convinced we didn't have a typical child. And then so the focus had always been on, him getting it from my husband. And then it was only through then learning so much about ADHD in my son, doing lots of research, that I started to see the parallels in myself as well. Then I started to follow on Facebook quite a lot of women ADHD groups. So many things were resonating with me, but I kind of thought, oh, it's just a coincidence, because my son's got this from the male genetic side. It's only the more that I've learned and the more that I've researched that I understand that neurodivergent people often gravitate to other neurodivergent people. Couples both have neurodiversity. I remember when I started to follow the women's groups, just a couple of things really hit home with me. And one was how exhausted women especially with ADHD are, because the hyperactivity is more in our mind.
This is something I wanted to look at, actually, because it was really interesting to me. Much like autism, most people sort of associate autism with the very male side of autism and the male traits, and we're sort of learning more and more that autistic women are present in a very different way to how autism presents in males. And it seems to be the same with ADHD. What we expect is this kind of like my son is bouncing off the walls, climbing, running from, can't focus on anything for long, has, constantly moving about. The hyperactivity side of it, I think, really focuses. But with females and ADHD, it seems to take on a very different thing. Do you want to go through what that's been like for you and why it was maybe hidden for so long?
I think a really good point for me as well, where the penny dropped, was that because I'd gone through a private diagnosis for my son, the organisation ran seminars, free seminars, webinars. And there was one about women. And I went on that before I went to seek my diagnosis. And I remember really quite clearly this one question where they asked everyone, do you feel you're hyperactive? And 80% of all of us put no. Then the person asked, if I were to say, do you have a busy mind, though, that never stops? You're constantly going over things, ruminating. If we were to say that's hyperactivity, would you now say you're hyperactive? Then 90% of people said yes.
Yeah.
And so that was a real thing for me about, again, understanding that a lot of it is your mind. So instead of, it being physically outward, it's the brain constantly asking questions, ruminating, going over problems at night time, thinking about all the things you haven't done, need to do. And of course, in the world, we talk about all of these things and everyone is doing it to a degree, but it's just that our brains are often doing it more. And then you've got the executive functioning side, which again, we know comes within autism, things like planning, organization, things that have steps to it are the things that for a neurodivergent mind can be quite taxing. And so that's where, again, the exhaustion comes in. So I could never really understand, why am I needing to nap every day at 2 p.m. or whatever time, but everybody else can kind of manage. I was getting enough sleep. But then it's when you start to be a bit more compassionate about the fact that actually everything that we're doing every day for our brain is harder work. And then just the very stereotypical things that you see, especially on kind of TikTok videos and things like that, of, walking into a room and going, why did I come in here?
Yeah.
And that not being just occasionally, but it being all day, being forgetful, trouble remembering appointments. And the one thing that again really clicked for me is this thing around RSD, the rejection sensitivity dysphoria thing. That made a lot of sense to me about my life, because I had trouble with friendships, but also if there was ever any friendship breakdown or bullying or just nasty comments, it really, really got to me, and I really struggled to manage it. And like most women with ADHD, we get diagnosed wrongly with things like depression, anxiety, personality disorders, often in our late teens. So for me, it was 18 when I could finally go on an antidepressant, essentially for medication. And realistically, looking back now, it was probably the wrong diagnosis all along. What I was suffering from was probably in some ways, the burnout of my ADHD only being managed by myself,
Mm.
and not really knowing myself and not really understanding why I was different, but feeling different, feeling alienated, but not having any understanding as to why.
Someone once explained it to me that they felt like they were standing outside a house looking in through the window and everybody else was in there, and that's the neurotypical world almost, but they sort of like, they didn't feel like part of it. They were standing outside looking in. Was it kind of like that?
Definitely. And I think also a loneliness around, and I don't know if this is true for every other person with ADHD, because obviously I only know my own experience, but thinking about things quite in depthly, quite existential stuff. You're like, why are we here? What's this all about? Going into quite big questions when other people seem to kind of tick along in life, just kind of managing it. So feeling quite distanced, and yet not really understanding, well, how are they all doing that so easily and so fluidly? But for me, it's so jarring.
It's something I've seen. I think a lot of, maybe it's the hyper focus side of things, but a lot of, I mean, autistic ADHD women that I know are very deep thinkers and go into this very, like you say, existential and really, philosophical approach. I think there's a reason why so many important discoveries and stuff are made by people who are neurodivergent, because apart from that, just a different way of looking at things and seeing things from that different perspective, I think it takes that kind of the need for somebody who's just going to pour over it and it's just going to be their focus for, X amount of time to really get to the details of these things. Where for me, it would be like, it'd be interesting at first and then it would be like, this is move on.
Or I think that hyper focus, like you say, can mean that those areas of hyper focus, the person becomes so knowledgeable in that area that they become a pioneer within that area. If it's computing, programming, or any other specialist interest, the knowledge base that they have is so vast. You pair that with, especially ADHD, the need for excitement, the need for not having too much routine, i.e., a lot of these people become entrepreneurs because there's that reward in kind of, they can just kind of manufacture the life that's more rewarding to them.
Yeah.
But then if you pair that with, like, my son and probably myself, the PDA side, you've also got the whole thing around, they don't really want to be told what to do by a boss, and they want to do things their way. But what it means is they move things forward because they are working to their own agenda, because they're not trying to just fit somebody else's mold. And I don't think it's a fluke that, neurodiversity is becoming bigger and bigger, and the population is becoming, a higher percentage of neurodiversity, because I do see it actually as an evolution, which I think is really lovely, that Whereas in the past, especially years ago, it's all seen as a kind of, there's quite a negative stance on it, and a deficit, and it's actually, well, look at what people with this neurodiversity are achieving, where they're taking us, what directions we're going in from that broader mind, from that passion in what they're interested in.
I was speaking with the guys from Awesome. They put me onto this thing that was Jimmy Carr did. It was just an interview he was doing on the radio, I think, and he talked about the fact that schools look for all rounders. It's all about, you've got to be okay at everything.
I think school teaches us maybe the wrong lesson. School teaches us a lesson about mediocrity and being all rounders, and yet we live in a world that does not reward all rounders. Who gives a fuck about all rounders? If you get a D in physics and you get an A in English, I say just go to English lessons, because we're going to get you up to a C grade in physics. I'll tell you what the world doesn't need: someone who's shit at physics. Still shit at physics.
What we need is people who are passionate about one thing and can focus on that and make that better. And I think that's where the neurodivergent community seems to gravitate toward that kind of approach anyway, because that focus becomes so much. Just drawing back, you were speaking there about the fact that, I mean, obviously your son is a PDA with ADHD and obviously part on the autistic spectrum as well. You spoke to me and said that just more recently that you felt that you were identifying more with PDA traits. What's been that process for you? What was that journey like?
I think it's probably helpful just to draw on how I came to the conclusion for my son as well, because I thought he had ODD, oppositional defiance, within his ADHD, but I started to see that for him it was less to do with fighting authority or having power against people that he perceived as more powerful than him, and it was more an anxiety presentation. And I actually went from then kind of really seeing him as a PDA and tracing that back to, okay, there probably is autism then, because it's a part of autism. So from that's then what kind of got me to where I am, because I've always identified in myself autistic traits sooner than I've identified as ADHD. I believe my father, had he have been diagnosed at a younger age, he would have been diagnosed with autism. And I've always known that I have some similarities. Again, as a female, like you said, it can be very different. And I mean, women, especially if they're very high functioning and masking well, you could go a lifetime without being diagnosed, not even realizing. So it's definitely been quite subtle, but I have always identified as having traits or being somewhere on the spectrum. So of course, again, once I really started to understand in my son this kind of anxiety base and started to do the research around, well, what are the sorts of things that they become demand avoidant about, that's when I started to, again, the penny drop with me, and I started to realize I do a lot of these things. And again, once I then started to look at it more in adults, because of course how my son's doing things as an 8-year-old at school is different to me as an adult, but there was enough correlation. But the more I looked into the adult side, the more I was like, okay, yep, this is all ringing pretty true. So things like job hopping, I don't stay in a job for very long. I have done, and I can, but I don't really like it if I'm giving a lot of rules. I need a lot of autonomy in my work. If I don't have it, I find it very hard to stay, because I need to vocalize how I'm feeling. I've always called myself an 80-20 person. So I can do the bulk 80, but I can't do that finishing 20, because that's the hard bit for me. That's the demanding side of it for me, the boring bits. So even like painting a wall, I can slap on most of it, but when you've got to be neat around the edges and there's a demand of doing it well, no, give up. Just not interested. And little things that other people have said along the way, I'm like, oh God, I didn't even think of that as a demand. So like an example is not finishing everything on your plate because we're told eat all your dinner. I've always left 2 mouthfuls, and I could never understand why, but I always did. And it's things like that. I'm realizing, oh, okay, it's because there's sort of a demand and an expectation under that. And things like, we're given quite a lot of health rules in life, things like drink 2 liters of water a day, eat 5 fruit and veg. I drink no water. I don't like water. I eat almost no fruit and veg. And I'm starting to, I'm really early days in this, in learning about myself. So I don't profess to be kind of all knowledgeable in this area. Every day I'm acknowledging, oh, okay, that's an example of a demand. And what's really nice is now at nearly 38, I'm able to look at myself with compassion for it rather than self-hatred. Up until now, it's always been, you're lazy, you're defiant, you're difficult. Now it's me going, oh, there's a reason for that, and that there's an anxiety base to that, and I'm craving my own autonomy, and that in itself then has a ricochet of having a really positive effect on your mental health.
I think that's good. There's something that really struck me in what you said there. There's this element that I think people are so, we often say we're our own worst critics. And I think what you said there about being able to view yourself with a level of compassion, I think it's something a lot of us miss. We know our inner selves better than anybody else, and we know our faults, and we can, present the best version of us to everybody else, but we know what's going on inside. And I think we can often be so judgmental towards ourselves. We can be really compassionate to everybody else, but when it comes to our own, what's in our own skin, we're very, very judgmental on ourselves. So many people watch this and probably identify with exactly what you're saying, that sense of, I never understood myself and therefore I was very harsh on myself. What's been the process of actually not just understanding I need to have compassion, but actually expressing it and allowing yourself to be compassionate to yourself?
I think it's been a real journey. I do think a certain amount of it is age. Like, I was speaking to someone the other day and they said equally when they were in their 30s, they started to be a bit kinder to themselves. I think we grow into our skin a bit more. We develop as people. We naturally become wiser. I've always had a thirst for self-development and self-growth. I'm training to be a counsellor, which I'm on my level 4, so I'll be qualified in July. We do a lot on our course around self-awareness and, how do we speak to ourselves? I'm also trained in CBT, so we know to think about our thoughts and the impact of our thoughts on our emotions. And what's the evidence of thought, which is always really interesting because, of course, when we're critical to ourselves, there's very little evidence of that. So everyone hates me. Okay, well, what's the evidence? Who's told you they hate you? What's anyone actually done to vocalize that? Okay, nothing. All right, so it's just a thought, and it's an unhelpful one. And so you're becoming more conscious. And I think for me as well, a bit of a spiritual awakening that happened for me a few years ago, which kind of ties in again with the sort of the existential stuff, but around realizing, I read a lovely book called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and it's about you are not your thoughts. And that was massive for me because I always had the understanding that my thoughts were my internal dialogue, i.e., it was almost like my dear diary. Yeah. So it was me expressing me. And that's not really the case. Like, thoughts come and go. And there's this lovely phrase or something like, thoughts are like clouds, they come and go, but we're the blue sky above it. That's always there. We are that beautiful, vibrant energy above. But those stormy, rainy clouds can come in and, they shadow all of it. But they're only a cloud. They're not permanent, and they go. And if something can come and go, it's not you. It's not who you are. And that was massive for me because then I could start to detach from the thoughts and realize this isn't really me talking. This is sort of my ego that kind of wants to keep me in a dark place, but I'm so much more than that.
Yeah.
And that helped with the compassion then, because I could start to go, that's just a thought. That doesn't mean it's true. And just because it's a thought that's come from me doesn't mean it's truth to me.
I love that stuff. And I think it's so true. I think if we're going to be understanding to, the whole point of this channel and what we're doing is the idea that trying to get neurodiversity understood by the masses, not just the neurodivergent community, but people outside it. And I think it's not until we start delving into that deeper self-awareness that we really start to unpick what's going on in people's minds. If we can have compassion for ourselves, then that's a compassion that we can start having for others. And I think that spreads. I think it starts with ourselves sometimes. And it's an interesting thing because I think sometimes the things that we hate the most in other people are often the things we hate about ourselves.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Holding the mirror up. Now that segues really neatly into, obviously, you've already said your son is a PDA, he's ADHD, he's autistic. One of the challenges that I often see in my home is that obviously with a neurodivergent wife and neurodivergent kids, and they can rub each other up the wrong way, but it's because they're so similar in those things. What's it like for you having to deal with that from your perspective?
It can certainly be more challenging on certain days. I quite like the spoon theory, how many spoons you've got. And so if I haven't had too much of my own challenging day, and then my son comes home at 3:30 and asks 20 demands of me, I can probably cope with that.
Yeah.
But on another day, if perhaps a lot of my spoons have been used up, I've had a demanding day, my brain is tired, perhaps I've had to use executive functioning skills more or whatever, then I can find it really, really difficult because I'm needing my own time really to decompress and to be demand free. But I don't have that luxury. Like I say, some days I can just respond to his demands very calmly and just do it. Other days I can feel myself. Sometimes I'll be in my bedroom and he'll go, "Mom," and I'll go, "Yes, darling," and it gets hard, and I just sometimes I'll have to even say to him, "Theo, I need 10 minutes now where you just don't ask me to do anything," because, and I'll try and say to him, think how hard you find it, people telling you to do things all day, sit down, stand up, don't talk. He said, you're asking me a lot of things, and mummy finds that hard too sometimes. But essentially, like most of us, as the parents, we're needs focused on our children.
Yeah.
And actually, what I have to learn to do really is not overload myself too much so that I can cope with his demands. But that's had a knock-on effect on my life. At the moment, I don't work so that I'm not my bucket's not full by the time he comes home. And although they're at school for 6-7 hours, I still can have him 3:30 till 9:30. That's a lot of hours of demands. Plus he's dysregulated, so I have to try and keep myself regulated. Co-regulation is something I'd never even heard of until recent months, of that they regulate off of our nervous system. So I was often doing quite stressful jobs, working with clients in domestic violence or children that were having struggles, and it was affecting my nervous system. And then I didn't have much to give. So I've had to really adapt my life so that I am able to respond to his level of demand without me then becoming dysregulated.
It's so true. I think that's just so much in that to unpack. The idea that we feed off each other, it becomes a vicious cycle. I know that when my daughter is dysregulated, when she's heading towards a meltdown and I'm seeing the warning signs, learning to keep myself really calm in that situation and start being logical, because my instinct is to sort of get angry, or as you do, you got someone being rude to you, throwing things, you're going to get cross. But being able to take a step back, breathe, look, I know you're upset, and have that calmness to my approach, which I constantly fail at, by the way. If you do the same, don't feel bad.
We're only humans, we're not perfect.
Exactly. You have to kind of break that vicious cycle of dysregulation between people. When you've got two people with very similar patterns of dysregulation, it's really going to get caught up in itself. So impressive that you're able to see that.
Well, and the difficulty I have, and you kind of in a way brought it up yourself, is when you just said then I'll get angry. Again, if we try and be compassionate about ourselves, we need to think about, well, what's happening in our body, our fight, flight, freeze. If your child is becoming heightened and dysregulated, if you know that that often means things get thrown at you, or you get hit, or they hurt themselves, of course your body is going to see that it's just going to go danger. That's all it's going to do. Saber-toothed tigers in the room, and your body's going to go into either a fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, if your response is fight, then that means, all that adrenaline comes out in a, I'm ready to fight back if I need to. Now, that's happening on a very, very biological level. That's a hard thing to suddenly then have control of. And with me, what I do is I become scared. So mine is more of a flight. I want to get the hell out of there. But because once I'm in that response of I'm in danger, I'm not able to respond very well to him. And that sometimes still might come out as anger because I'm dysregulated myself then. And so I think what it's about when and where we can is, like you say, if and when it's building, and I don't really do this yet, but this is sort of almost the next step for me in my growth as a parent of a PDA with PDA myself, is when it's maybe starting to build, do your breathing techniques then. Preempt that your body's going to go into a nervous system response, and almost sort of say to the body, we're not in as much danger as we think we are, or tell yourself, yes, this might happen, but I'm not going to be at as much risk as perhaps my nervous system is thinking it might be.
Exactly. That whole, the amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain instantly presents us with the worst case scenario, and that's what it's responding to. And what you're talking about there is, I mean, we've spoken about it so many times on this channel, is the idea that we've got the three parts to the brain, and logic goes when we're in that heightened thing, logic's gone. And what you're saying there is actually exactly what I try and do, and what I try and do for my daughter to bring her back to that point, is re-engage logic before it's gone. We're not actually in as much danger as we think. I understand that my fight, flight, or freeze, my trauma response is going to the worst case scenario. What's it actually like at this point? And when we can engage, if I can engage my logic part of the brain and make sure it's sticking with me, then I find I can manage that response a lot more easily. But it's such an important point to make as well. I really like what you said there, is that you've got to be compassionate to yourself. And it's a theme that's coming through this, but the idea that, you are going to fail, you are going to make mistakes, and you're going to say the wrong thing, and you're going to find that you are human, like you said. But being able to understand it was a moment, breathe, forgive myself for what I've done, and then I can go, and actually I find it really helps. I can go, to my daughter and say, I reacted badly, and I'm really sorry.
And that's what I was going to say, the apology afterwards, when you acknowledge that you didn't come from a regulated place, it helps them to understand what was going on for them. It helps them to learn to be accountable for their feelings. And you're mirroring what you want as well, which is to acknowledge that how you responded wasn't ideal.
Yeah, and I think that cements it, doesn't it, in our own minds, when we know, when we've had to talk about it afterwards and we've done a bit of self-reflection, it's in that self-reflective area that we make those improvements to be, like you say, improving ourselves so that tomorrow is better than today, and the way we deal with it tomorrow is better than how we dealt with it today.
I say this to a lot of people. I've worked with a lot of parents throughout my career. There is no rule book about being a parent. There are theories, there are professionals that have their view, and that in itself can make life difficult because you've got so many opposing ways of doing it. Super nanny, and then you've got conscious parenting, and then you've got low demand parenting. There's so many different things. It's overwhelming in itself. But even if there was the rule book sort of for typical children, all of that goes out the window for neurodiversity. I used to be a behaviorist. I trained in behaviorism. I was very much reward, punishment, and I was good at it. I would have been a very good dog trainer because I really understood that, and I found it fascinating because I've always been into psychology. I'm interested in people and how, by rewarding, you can get more of a behavior that you want. But actually, I learned after trying all the star charts and the timeout, which I only did once actually because it went so badly, that none of that worked. And so not only did I have to throw out all of the books that tried to tell me the rules, I also had to throw out my own learning and my own kind of, not passion as such, but my own interest around behavior, and pretty much flip it on its head. And that's something I'm actually really proud of in myself. I am someone that will often focus on the things that I'm not good at and the things that need work, and like I say, this compassion is new, but I've always been really proud of myself that I can question my perspective, and that if I'm given evidence against what I believe, I can take that on. I'm not a stubborn thinker. I'm not like, nope, this is what I believe and it's sticking like this. I'm very open-minded, and so I feel lucky in that sense, because it's meant that I've been very open to learning new things. And that's when I've then learned about low demand. And from learning about low demand, I've learned what PDA is and how to approach that. And from that, my relationship with my son and my son's ability to thrive is so much better, because I was willing and open to a different perspective. The hard thing is when the people in our lives around us aren't as willing.
Yeah.
You then have an extra battle of, not only are you trying to learn a new way, you're having to kind of defend it to a lot of people. And you've got to, again, in your compassion, almost let go of needing that validation from everybody else, and just know in yourself, this is what is right for me and my child, because it's only us that have been in this journey doing it day in, day out.
Exactly what you said there. There's that element there that we do learn the wrong things. There's a reason science is constantly moving on, because they make new discoveries and learn different things. And, 20 years ago, eggs were bad. Now eggs are good. All this kind of stuff. It's like as we learn more and more. But, you were talking there about that whole thing of, reward and punishment. And essentially, that's ABA.
Yeah. And I was an ABA therapist for 2 years with an autistic child. So it was drummed into me.
That's it. And then here you are. And so much respect that somebody, and this is what I don't see enough, is that you've seen the damage and you're going, okay, that's not the way to do it. And you're moving on. And how much of a better advocate are you for the community itself, and the neurodivergent community, than somebody who's been there, done that, and said, this isn't right?
Yeah.
I think that's awesome. I think that's a good place to leave it for this one. Sarah and I are going to do this probably a bit more regular every now and again, catch up and discuss this stuff as the stuff that she's learning and the stuff I'm learning, and it all comes through. We'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you've got kids who are neurodivergent and you're coming to the understanding of neurodiversity yourself, and maybe that you yourself are neurodivergent. Put it in the comments. What you share in the comments allows other people to read and to get that bigger perspective, and it's stuff that we can pick up on and use in these episodes in the future. So please go and do that. Sarah, I can't thank you enough for joining me in this. I think it's been fascinating.
Thank you for having me. I hope it's been useful to people. And if any questions have come up, specifically around what I've talked about, and anyone wants to, know more, or us focus on anything particular, then I'm really open to it, because, I'm learning all the time. But I think when you're in this world, you want to give back what you're learning and support other people. So I'm really keen if there's anything that's, really sparked an interest, or people want us to delve into certain areas, as long as I've got a bit of warning to maybe go and do my own bit of research, then, I would love to be part of.
Amen. Well, we'll do that. So please put it in the comments and we will follow up on that. We'll see you again on the next episode. In the meantime, please do stay safe.